thank Dr. Sangeeta and Delnet for inviting me here. And it's a privilege to be the international speaker. I hope that my presentation will be useful. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to approach me after this session. So I will speak about the UNESCO Toolkit, but first I would like to say two things, actually based on some of the morning sessions. I would like to ask a few questions on why is DRM important, why is disaster risk management important, and what actually does it mean to preserve collections and protect library collections, and what is the role of libraries today? I think the one thing that I want to emphasize, and you as librarians, professionals in this field, it seems really important to say that today, one thing that's the role of libraries, to me, is to provide, of course, access to information. But if we think about it further, what that means is actually you provide an opportunity for people to understand the world, not just the world around them, but also worlds that are further out there. And so the role of libraries is really crucial in the sense that how you understand the world, how you see yourself in the world, and how you see yourself in relationship to other people is something very important to understand. When we speak about new frontiers, we live in a world today when, in fact, understanding is jeopardized. To understand others is something that is actually at a critical point. What it means to understand and how we acquire knowledge is very crucial. Where do we get knowledge from? We speak about AI, for instance. We'll say, AI will provide information to me. Well, we'll use AI to get information. But how do we use this information? How do we access it? How do we make sure that this information is valuable? And then how does this information shape the way we think? How we think in the world about others? How do we perceive ourselves? How do we perceive others? These are all questions that are very important to understand today. And the reason why it's important to preserve information is because information is the place where we actually shape our ways of behaving in the world. The way we see the world shapes the way we behave in the world. And that's quite important to understand. To me, today, I would like to emphasize on this point. If we do not have quality information and a good understanding, then our behavior will start changing because we behave through ignorance, through prejudice, and we will make assumptions about things and people. Therefore, it's important to have information and to have the ability to understand this information in a way that is with, of course, like we mentioned before, literacy, information literacy, in the digital world. We have a lot of information today, but how we use this information is very critical. We have more information than ever before. We have more access than ever before. But do we know how to use this information? And do we use it well? This is a question that needs to be emphasized. And it's a little bit further out of the disaster risk management topic, but I think disaster risk management is also about that. It's about understanding why it's important to preserve and what we should preserve. We cannot preserve everything. We cannot save everything that is out there. So today I will explain a little bit about this idea of what happens in a disaster. What do we call it? First, how do we understand disasters? Because most people think they know what disasters are, but in fact, there is a lot of misconceptions and limited understanding of this subject. So of course, we all have seen images of disasters. We can all picture what is a disaster. The first thing when we think of disaster is the physical destruction of something, physical sites, how fires will destroy entire buildings. And of course, if you're a library, of course you have to think, how vulnerable are you? How vulnerable is your collection? What kind of conditions do you have in terms of storing your materials, etc. So we all know what disasters are as physical events. What is interesting, however, is that most of the time people know what disasters are, but most people don't know how to prepare for disasters. It's not just here in India, it's everywhere in the world. It's also in very advanced places in the world, places where there are a lot of, you could say, more economic resources. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily better prepared. It's not just about the financial means. In fact, you can have less financial means and be better prepared. So it's all relative. We spoke about the digitization of libraries and this aspect of digital contents. This is a picture, actually this happened very recently in Korea. I don't know if you heard about it, but there was a huge fire in October, and it's destroyed a majority of government records, which were, I think, something like 80% of which were not backed up. And the reason they said why they didn't back up this data was because it was too big to back up. But you see, the thing is that nowadays you think, oh, there's a cloud storage, so I'm safe. The cloud is perceived as this invisible, non-physical storage, but it's actually a physical place that stores all of these. So more and more you have to also think of course, digital disasters and the implications, and the cost of a digital disaster is massive. In a way, it could be much bigger than a physical one. So going back in time, some of you may remember that about 20 years ago there was a major tsunami that hit across South and Southeast Asia. And I like to take this example to raise awareness on how much a disaster can impact a place when a place is not prepared. This tsunami, in fact, of course, damaged permanently, destroyed a lot of archival records. But what is also interesting to see is that it took more than a decade to do a recovery, and it's almost a never-ending thing. So in fact, to not be prepared means that you will have to pay a very high price. And even if you feel like you don't have the means to be prepared, the smallest steps, even a small step, can make a big difference. So you always should start small and then look at how you can make the small steps first and start developing a disaster management plan, even if it feels like it's a very daunting task. And this toolkit is, in fact, is a way to help you get started, because you will get a very kind of practical way of starting this exercise. One thing that is crucial before you start a plan is to understand what your situation is. This means that each person, each institution will have a different way of planning based on the situation where they are. It's not the same for everyone. It depends on the size of your institution. It depends where you're located, the sort of geographical factors. So in that sense, you have to first understand the sort of risks that you are confronted with. And you have to understand how to communicate about these risks. And also, one thing is that is important to know is that disasters are not just external events, but it can come from it's a sort of interaction of different factors. It's not just the external thing that happens to you, it's the interaction between what happens to you and then how much resilience you have to mitigate and to respond to that event in case it happens. So I will explain to you these two categories of factors that will really determine your situation. On the one hand, you have the risk factors. So these are what is the probability of experiencing a hazard in your area. So you will start listing what sort of events, natural disasters that may happen. And these are, you can find that through historical records or through recent events that you've been through. Then, in relationship to that, you have your vulnerability factor. So it means how likely is it that damage occurs to the assets that you have? If an event occurs, how much risk will that pose to your collection? Then you have exposure. How much property and infrastructure would be exposed to the hazard? That means your building, the environment you're in, how much is that exposed to a potential hazard? So these are the risk factors that you evaluate in the beginning. And then, in relation to the risk, you have your resilience factors. One is support. What are the existing structures in terms of access to assets, decision-making, and economic opportunities? The other thing is management. Have you been trained to mitigate disasters? Are you equipped? Do you have the materials? Have you managed the preparation? And then there is also the way you communicate about disaster with your communities and your stakeholders. These aspects will determine how resilient you can be. So the more organized you are, and the more trained you are, and the more likely you are resilient to a potential disaster. I want to show you also some recent numbers. So this was 2 years ago, recorded by the UN Agency for Disaster Risk Reduction. And you can see that floods represent 46% of global natural disasters worldwide. But you also have storms and earthquakes. The storms which have the highest impact in terms of economic losses. So physically, it's very destructive. Of course, earthquakes are also very destructive and come at a high cost. But the floods are more frequent globally. And in Asia and India, you are witnessing that excessive rainfall, unpredictable weather, so linked to these very stormy, rainy seasons. But even now, like we just recently witnessed some events in Sri Lanka and south of India where there was a cyclone, and also in Indonesia. So the frequency of natural disasters in Asia represents 73% of the total globally. So we are in an area where disasters happen extremely frequently and strongly impact not only human lives. I mean, of course, human lives and economic loss is huge, but you also have to think in your context as librarians, as documentary heritage custodians. You have a high chance of being impacted. So I don't know, maybe some of you have already, maybe we can discuss later, but some of you may have experienced disaster already. So with this UNESCO toolkit, so I was working with UNESCO in Bangkok until earlier this year. Before I joined IGNCA, I was with UNESCO in Bangkok, and we developed this toolkit because we made a survey which showed that 63% of institutions did not have any plan for disaster risk management. So they really there was a high risk and vulnerability among all cultural heritage institutions. And the reason why we developed this toolkit was to prevent further disasters, mitigate the risks, but also to train professionals like you. Here I will show you a few case studies that we included in the toolkit. So I will share some links also with you later. You can download the toolkit and see it for yourself. So here are some examples of how natural disasters have impacted Asian countries. So this was in China, where typical, disaster where basically archives are destroyed and water damage is the most frequent. In fact, water damage is where most institutions will get started with to train on how to recover water damage documents. And all these case studies include a lot of examples of how different institutions do their disaster management training and preparation. So you can see that there are different models. Like, let's say in China, they might do it in one way, and then in India, it would be very different as well. But they always follow very similar patterns, which is that in most cases, of course, the disaster happens unexpectedly. This was, you may be familiar with this very unexpected flood in Rajasthan, and the Jaipur, the Albert Hall Museum in Jaipur had floods in their storage, so they had to modify some of the structure. So these are examples of how the building is crucial, like how your building is designed will directly have an impact on your collection and the way things could go really bad, or if you prepare yourself, then you can change and modify your building. These are also like floods in Thailand. This is the Thai Film Archive. So again, it was excessive rainfall that triggered this, and then people were not prepared. Actually, they had no experience in disaster risk management, but they coordinated with each other very quickly. So in fact, they managed to avoid the worst because they really did work around the clock. So it's also like the dedication of your staff and how willing they are to protect the collection. Then you have earthquakes. Again, this was in China. So with earthquakes, what is very important to understand is that most of the time the places are not accessible for many days because there are rescue operations, so you are not allowed to go to certain areas. And meanwhile, when areas become closed, you cannot rescue the documents. So the documents will get damaged in the process of rescuing the people first, and documents will always come last. So they're usually, it happens when documents are left untouched for several weeks, and often you have things like rain, mold happening, humidity problems. This is quite a long time ago in Japan, but I want to show you this example because, in fact, in Japan, natural disasters are part of everyday life. So the culture of disasters is actually part of Japanese culture. So in Japan, it's viewed as almost as accepted. It's a very different way of dealing with disasters because people accept this feeling of also impermanence, that nothing is permanent, and disasters actually fed the cultural and spiritual life of Japan in that sense. But also what is interesting is that because disasters are so frequent, there are many volunteers. So most of the time, in fact, this network, which was established right after this earthquake in Kobe, which is near Osaka, they basically networked with many different types of people. the community, historians, disaster specialists, and they grew over decades. They became a national kind of volunteer base, and they are actually very active. Whenever something happens, they help each other, and they will go to like the different communities and work together to rescue, either to salvage the documents, to do recovery efforts, but also to raise awareness on what needs to be done when a disaster hits. So this is quite interesting, and I think in India there could be similar possibilities to do similar things because you have strong communities here. Storms, so this is an example from the Philippines, where they had major problems accessing sites, so they had a lot of lost collections and documents, and they were not prepared actually to, basically enter the sites and do the recovery as they could have done because they just didn't have the coordination between the rescue teams and the institutions. So now I will show you the toolkit itself. So I will show you the different modules. There are 6 modules, and I will go through each stage. Basically, we actually with Heather Brown, so she was very important in our team because she really had a lot of experience in this field. But we decided to have 6 modules so that you could step by step start your disaster plan, but you could also start with one module and maybe skip the second one and then do a third one. Like this toolkit doesn't have to be from beginning to end. You can actually choose where you want to focus on. But of course, module 1 is really important because that's the beginning where you start assessing your situation. So we made questionnaires, we have templates, and you start to evaluate yourself. So you can see where you have strengths or weaknesses. Where do you need to build more capacity? Where do you need to analyze more of your situation? So again, here, like there are 6 elements here on this slide, which I would say are essential elements to understand your situation. What are your resources, and what kind of network do you have? That is number 1, of course, in relationship to anything related to disasters. Then it's also your collection. How is your collection stored? How much do you have? What is the condition? These things. Then the management of your institution and your staff, human resources. What kind of training do they get? How many people do you have? How much knowledge do they have about the collection? Then you have climate and geography. So this is your environment. What kind of area do you live in? What sort of disasters happen in your area? You have to list everything as accurately as possible. I'll show you how you can do that. Your community and the histories that are embedded in your area. What are the, you have indigenous communities that have a lot of knowledge about disasters, about environmental conditions. And sometimes it's very good to go to your community to understand what can be done. You may have an elderly person who knows a lot about mitigation. In fact, there are traditional ways of mitigating natural disasters. Natural disasters have occurred for thousands and thousands of years, so they are nothing new, and people have developed ways to counter them. So, and then of course your building, the architecture of your building, how it's set up and how it's designed. So this is, I'll just quickly go through because I don't want to take up too much time, but these are like the sort of questionnaires that you can try, and you can go through these questions, and then you will evaluate yourself and understand your situation. Module 2 is an essential aspect of disaster management, which is the risk assessment. So again, what I mentioned earlier, where do you keep your documents and in which storage conditions? So we have these templates that you can use, and you go through your collection with these templates and you can evaluate your storage and whether you need to take action or not. If something is actually a little bit risky, what kind of action can you take? So we do have chapters that give you advice on how to mitigate the risks and what sort of plan you can have to basically improve your condition of storage. Here you have a template for hazards. What kind of hazards do you have? What is the probability? And what is your action plan? So again, it's very practical. Everything is, you know, you just kind of complete these forms and you'll start to understand where you are. We have also a chapter on health hazards. As you may know, like some documents, older documents also have, can have toxic materials. So we have these chapters to explain how to handle toxic materials, how to be careful with mold also. So you have, you know, biohazards, living organisms. Module 3 is about your team. Each disaster plan should have a disaster team, and you have to know how to communicate with each other. So, emergency contact list, do you have one? And have you started looking at who in your area will be the emergency responders? And who will be responsible for the different tasks in case of a disaster, which team will be responsible and which people will be doing what? You have to determine that very clearly. So here again, we have this form. You can, one by one, you can designate. If you have a short, you know, a limited staff, you of course, you cannot have all of the different roles, but you pick the most important roles, or you can combine different roles, and some people may have to multitask and take on different hats. But then when you look at this template, you will understand exactly what kind of responsibilities are crucial. In the case of, if you don't do this and a disaster happens, you cannot coordinate yourselves. You will not be able to respond because you will go, first you will panic, you will not know what to do, you will not know who is in charge of what. Therefore, this is very important to do many months before, even years before something happens. You need to clearly know who will do what. Module 4 is on collections management. So again, I forgot to mention, but this toolkit is not just for libraries. So it can be for museums, for archives. It's in fact for any institution that has a collection that works on preservation and conservation of heritage. But in fact, it could also even be for a business. I often think about even if you're a company and you have assets, you do have files, you do have your documents, you do have your records. You know, any entity will have a sort of archive that is important to protect. In a collection, you will have, and this is something quite important in terms of prioritizing what is most important. In many cases, you will have collections and people will not know exactly what to rescue first. Because you tend to want to rescue everything. Or some people will prefer something over another. But this is not about a personal choice to say, oh, I want to rescue this object because it's my favorite object in the collection. It's not because it's by taste, your favorite one, that it's necessarily more significant. So these templates explain how you can evaluate the importance of an object. The importance of an object is not a personal thing. It is a much bigger thing that relates to a community, that relates to a wider context. It can have a local significance, it can have a national significance, it can have a regional significance, and it can have an international significance. So again, of course, the local significance is extremely important. To me, in fact, it's more important than international. Some people will say, oh, it's important because it's recognized by UNESCO. But in fact, even I work with UNESCO, but I think the local significance is more important because it will speak to the community, and it's the community that will decide what is the most important thing for them. and it's not because an international body will tell them what is important. So this form will explain those things to you. And of course, you have one thing that is emphasized quite often by Heather Brown is the link between physical and digital collections. You have a physical collection in your library, and you will have a digital copy of it. And sometimes you don't coordinate these two aspects. So you need to make sure that you know which digital file corresponds to which physical object and where each is located. Disaster kit, that is basically like the materials that you need to procure. You need to have a specific kind of emergency kit. It's like a rescue kit for a human being, but this one would be for your documents and for your collection. Module 5 is on digitization and what we call climate action, because digital technology is environmentally not very good. You may have heard that it consumes a lot of water, it consumes a lot of energy. So we do have a chapter on e-waste also too, because it's all like, it's a vicious circle. The more technology we use and the more impact it has on climate change. So we have to be aware that digital is actually has a carbon footprint. Digital has an impact on global warming, these kind of things. We may think that it doesn't do anything to use a smartphone or a computer, but actually it does a lot. It is like completely depletes water resources. It uses gallons of water to cool down a data center. It uses millions of gallons of water. These are the sort of things we never think about, but we should be aware of that, because it is about the future. It's about sustainable environmental responsibility. We all have a responsibility in using digital equipment. We never think about it because it's invisible. We never think about. So we do have, because digital is also about your equipment. After 5 years, it will be very old. It ages very quickly. Something that you buy today, in a few years, will be completely outdated. That is also the reality of the digital technology. Of course, it's extremely empowering. It will give us a lot of freedom, ability to do a lot more, but it comes at a very high price. So that is also something that we mentioned in this toolkit. The risk of your equipment breaking down, you have to think of that as well. Your equipment will not last forever. Your equipment has to be replaced regularly, otherwise you have a digital disaster. You will have something breaking down and your whole backup or the whole digital storage maybe one day will go, just because your computer or your hard drive was not updated or you didn't renew your equipment. You have to budget all of these things. You have to think about when are you going to upgrade your equipment. And sometimes the cost of that is higher than the physical, for the physical collection, because it's a very, very technical thing. So I'll let you look at it closely, like these sort of digital preservation cycles. It requires a lot of steps and of course a lot of equipment. So I'll let you just look at those things closely when you get the toolkit on your laptop or your phone. And again, I want to emphasize, because we're talking about these, technological improvements and innovations, there are more and more threats as to how data is stored, and then the fires. Physically, digital is not a safe haven. There are many risks associated, so we need to also think of not only the physical damage that can occur, but these cyber attacks, which are, I believe last year the number of cyber attacks and cyber crimes have increased by 600% in the world. This was a UN report on cyber crimes and why it's completely exploded because the criminal activity is, in fact, they are so advanced technologically, much more than governments. So what they can do, and they actually, of course, use AI better than anyone else to do these things. So you have to be very, very prepared as institutions, because this is increasing and there are a lot of targets now. I'll just skip this one. And then module 6 is response and recovery. This is the worst case scenario. In fact, like to think of that you will have to recover your documents is the worst case scenario, because if you've done your plan very well, you should have mitigated as many risks as possible, and you should have been prepared to not have to recover anything. So this is worst case scenario if something happens. And we do kind of, this is a very useful scale to segregate. In fact, disasters don't have the same impact depending on the level they're at. You could have a small leakage from the ceiling, and this water leak can turn into a major disaster if you don't do anything about it. You can have a major flood that floods the whole building. So depending on the scale of your disaster, you have to respond in a different way. So this disaster scale shows you exactly how you can respond based on the size of the disaster. Also, in the case of water disasters, you have different materials and different responses based on the material that you have. If it's paper, of course, it's the most urgent. If it's stone or ceramic, it will, of course, be less urgent to rescue because it will manage the water better. So these are the sort of tables you can use to respond accordingly. Then freezing also, freezing for...
Can you finish?
Yes, I will wrap up. It's almost finished. So the freezing is basically to avoid mold and biohazards. Listing the locations of the collections, so where the collections are located, and that's it. That's the last slide. So if you have any questions, of course you can ask after this session, and then you can email me if there's anything that you want to discuss in a more specific context. And I have a few bookmarks that you can get from me. I can distribute them. Thank you.
Yeah.